All right, what's up, everybody? Happy Monday to you. Nice to see you. Hope you're doing well. Hope it was a good weekend. Let's see. So I'll go over just a couple of nuts and bolts announcements with assignments and the class. Had a little mishap with the grade book over the weekend, but it's fixed now. So thanks. A number of you alerted me to this over the weekend where it hadn't synced your grades from the perusal to Canvas. But that's all fixed now, or should be good. And so thank you, Maribel. I think you were one of the students that alerted me to this. I'm feeling like we're in a pretty good groove otherwise with using perusal and the technical aspects of the class. If you do see something that looks weird or funky, especially with regard to grades, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. That was very helpful. Um, the work that you have this week, I sort of backed up the due date for this last Karl Marx reading and annotation assignment because we fell a little bit behind.
Eating candy off the ground.
So for this class and
Spit it out.
its
That's my
class
production.
again
Go
next
on.
week, we will be looking at capital, Marx's so-called Das Kapital, which is honestly a very difficult thing to take on your own. Um, and so I'm hoping that I'll be able to be of assistance in helping guide you through that reading for this week on capital. This will be our last week with Marx. Um, you have very important to note, a quiz that has just opened up on Canvas. As I explained on the first day of class and other classes, these quizzes are ones that you have a week to complete. Um, so you can open up the questions, look at what's being asked, close it out, come back to it, look at the readings and the other materials that you have. You have all the materials that you need at your disposal. So it's kind of more like an open book test or um, a take home test than it is like a pop quiz or something like that. So that's what I recommend that you do. Go ahead, Precious. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. So the quizzes, are they going to be in this week's module?
Yeah, they should be in there.
Because I
Let
think
me
it was
go ahead and go to the screen share.
okay.
And
And oh, it was perusal I was in. I'm sorry.
that's good. Let's see, where'd we go? Dun, dun, dun. So here under modules, boom, right here, quiz number 1, Marx.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And there won't if there's no more reading because I was on perusal this morning and I didn't see, I guess, week five's readings. We still are on four, or will it be
Yeah.
after class?
Well, there you have a reading thing that's due for the last one for Marx, which I think is number 4.
Hmm.
And then I put the one for Dirk, the first one for Durkheim, up today, and that'll be
Okay.
due Monday, October 6th.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't see it this morning. I was just wondering. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Um, yeah, so this will be after this week. We'll start with Durkheim on September 29th. So I'll give it, and we'll have like basically 6 class sessions on Durkheim. Um, And let me think. I think that that's pretty much like all the nuts and bolts kinds of questions about assignments and things of that matter. Anything from those of you who are here? Any questions? Go ahead, Mason.
I'm a little late. Did we already do the attendance thing with our name in the chat?
Yeah, you could just still please do put your name into the chat. I wrote you
Okay.
down though. I saw you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. Much to my chagrin, last class, I got my Zoom went out just as I was going into a rant about Labubus. And so we didn't totally finish off the Communist Manifesto, but we got through the most important part, which is really this first part, which I've highlight a lot of this section called bourgeois and proletarians, because as I emphasized in a lot of ways, this part of the Communist Manifesto is actually about capitalism and about the bourgeoisie as a ruling class. And so that's really the most important part of the reading. This second part that's called Proletarians and Communists, as I mentioned, it kind of takes this form of an imaginary dialogue where Marx and Engels are kind of carrying on this imaginary argument with people who would be their critics or their naysayers. So it's kind of like it's structured in this like, you accuse us of this, and this, but in fact, here's why you're wrong, or here's why you're hypocritical, or here's what we really think, as opposed to what you accuse us of thinking. And I think that part is fairly straightforward and doesn't require as much from me to help you get through it. There's been a good dialogue that's been kind of going on about this. They touch on all kinds of things about property and about family and women, about why would anybody do any work in a communist society if they weren't forced to do that, to work. Wouldn't everybody just be like lazy? So they answer all of these various kinds of criticisms in this kind of imaginary dialogue with their adversaries. Remember, this is supposed to be a political pamphlet that they would like hand out to workers when they were leaving the factory, or that they might give to people at a protest or a demonstration. This is this sort of like pamphlet about like, these are the things that we believe, and this is what we think needs to be done. And so it ends here with this 10-point platform, which I think is kind of interesting, just to look over. As I've said a number of times, Marx and Engels are generally pretty vague about what they mean by a communist society, and so this is the irony that Marx is known as like the father of communism, when in fact he spent most of his life writing about capitalism, and his ideas about communism were more like a vision or an imagination, or a kind of a vague idea. But he made fun of people who tried to get more specific and tried to be to create what he called like a cookbook for the revolution. He thought that was basically a bad idea, um, and kind of like intellectually arrogant. The whole idea of a revolution is that people figure these things out together, and they figure them out collectively and in the moment. And it's not something that like some highfalutin intellectual can just draw up, like a blueprint in their office for, what the future society is going to look like or supposed to look like. This has to be something that people figure out collectively together on their own. And so they're very kind of vague about these things. This 10-point program here is about as specific as they get. This 10-point program is not really like a vision of what a communist society would look like. This is more like a 10 like reforms or 10 demands that they are trying to get people to fight for, to struggle for in the immediate present. So these are things that we can do, in their minds, like right now, um, as a stepping stone towards a revolution. So these are more kind of like reforms, and this is an important part of like what political parties do. Like more than 100 years later, the Black Panther Party, when they started in Oakland in 1966, they also had a 10-point program that they put in all their newspapers and that they passed out to people, and that they would have like meetings where the 10-point program would be prominently displayed, and members were expected to know, all the 10 points. And they basically had to do with like demands for better housing, demands for better jobs, demands that, political prisoners and other, incarcerated people be set free, demands for school, healthcare, those sorts of things. So in other words, like reforms, things that, could be changed within the system, like relatively immediately. And you see here that Marx and Engels' 10-point program is also kind of along these lines. It's like, we want a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. This is the second point. Meaning that like basically the wealthy are going to pay more in taxes than poor people or working class people do. That's what we mean by a progressive tax, a progressive income tax, or a progressive wealth tax. We kind of used to have that in the United States, and it's been kind of slowly eaten away by the tax cuts for rich people, and like estate tax cuts and other cuts in taxes on wealth that kind of started in the Reagan era during the 80s, and then George W. Bush cut taxes for wealthy people further, and then of course like Trump's so-called big beautiful bill that passed last year cuts taxes for the wealthiest Americans by over $1 trillion. Yeah, go ahead, Precious.
So are you talking about the Proposition 25? And I didn't know that Trump had charged taxes to the billionaires. I thought he was in fact trying to do the exact opposite.
No, they cut the tax rate for billionaires.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Sorry.
I don't know what Prop 25 is.
Um, it's a I don't even know. My brain is so just mushed up today. Let me get back to you on that.
No, that's good.
Yes, Project 25. I told you my brain's not that big.
Project 2025 is
Yes.
certainly that was like the the right wing wish list that they drew up before Trump's election, and they basically were like, "This is what we're going to do," and so if Trump gets into office again, and you see all those things are being enacted to the letter today. It's all about cutting taxes for the wealthy, a mass deportation force that we're seeing with ICE, and also this kind of like censoring of criticism, whether it's, people like Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, or whether it's, college students speaking out about Palestine, or, professors speaking out about Palestine. All of those things are laid out in the playbook of 2025. They basically told people what they were going to do if they got the chance, and now they're doing it.
Isn't that what Harris was saying during when she was running? That's one of her
Yeah, a lot of people were
points.
saying, like, if you look at what they've told us what they want to do. They want to abolish the Department of Education, and they want to cut all these forms of foreign aid, and so yeah, if anything, um, I wish the Democrats had made an even bigger stink about it.
And one more thing. So
Sure.
would you say that like after Trump, we'll have like a mess to clean up, kind of like it was with Bush?
Unquestionably. I hope we're still alive to clean up the mess.
That part right
I
there.
hope that the damage isn't like too irreversible, because a lot of the mess that Obama inherited, he was not able to clean up, you know, as far as like the power of the banks and the financial institutions that had, driven us into this, into that recession. So yeah, there's no doubt that there's going to be a lot of wreckage from this time that we're living through, and yeah, I hope we're around to clean it up.
Yeah, if we are, Trump will definitely be in a many history books.
There's no question that he's going to be in history books regardless. Like yeah, this is a we're living through a very pivotal moment in history, and it's still not certain how it's all going to turn out.
Yeah, I'm just not understanding like if what because I'm not politically aware and
Seems pretty politically aware to me.
oh thank you. But my thing is that with all these changes and just breaking of laws pretty much that Trump is doing, um where's our laws that are in place to prevent this, like the due process and things of that sort? Like, are we just ignoring that now? And if we ignore it, are we going to eventually abolish it? Like,
Yeah, so again, this is a thing that Project 2025 told people explicitly what they were going to do, that they were going to basically, um, it's like a little child that is constantly testing the boundaries of what they can get away with, so they're going to constantly violate the law, like, for example, by sending the National Guard into Los Angeles when the governor didn't call for it. Or these kind of ICE raids where they're doing racial profiling explicitly, going to Home Depots and stuff, and arresting people without due process, and then doing God only knows what with them in these ICE detention centers. They're basically like flouting the law to see what they can get away with, and what the courts will enforce. And in some cases, the courts have limited them. For example, Trump wanted to send the National Guard to Chicago, and talked about it for many weeks, but I think was held back from doing that by the threat of legal action. Whereas now he's going to send them to Memphis, where the governor is a Republican and there's much more favorable political environment for doing that in the state of Tennessee, as opposed to in the state of Illinois, where the governor is a Democrat and the mayor is a Democrat, and they don't want the National Guard there. You know, just like we don't want the National Guard here in California.
Yeah, when the National Guard come out, is that like martial law?
Yeah, so that's basically like troops in the streets, and martial law, and like a curfew. And if you're out past the curfew, you can just be arrested. That has been done. That was done a lot in the 1960s in response to urban uprisings, you know, so-called riots. It was done more recently, like in Ferguson, Missouri, after the killing of Michael Brown, and the protests from Black Lives Matter, when the cops were not charged for that murder. So generally what happens is that a governor calls in the National Guard because they're like, yeah, we can't, basically like they're calling for backup. Like we can't police our citizens anymore. And like people are, you know, rioting and causing all kinds of civil disturbances. And so we need like extra troops. And that's what happens is the governor calls them in. But in the case of like what happened in Los Angeles a couple of months ago, the governor didn't call in the National Guard. The mayor didn't call in the National Guard. They were vociferously opposed the idea of sending troops into Los Angeles. And the Trump administration did it anyway. And that is flagrantly against the law. And the courts have ruled now that that is against the law. And so the attitude is very much this kind of flagrant law breaking that, again, I would compare it to like a child that is just constantly trying to see what it can get away with, and pushing the boundaries, and just, you know, doesn't take no for an answer. I think that's kind of what we're seeing.
I think it's when it comes to President Trump, I think it's kind of like we should expect it because of all the turmoil he was in legally before he even gained his position. So what he's doing now really shouldn't be surprising. But I think that just says um it gives a broader picture of just the human species and how we are stuck in this repetitious cycle of repeating history and being the creators of our own demise, as like what Marx was saying, as to how things were going on in his times and the
Yes.
things that he foreseen, and how we are still so many years later dealing with them same exact issues, same as structural racism and institutional and all that. It's just like they say you learn from history so you won't be doomed to repeat history, but yet and still we knowingly do this. And the more I learn, it's making me real discouraged.
I feel your pain. I understand what you mean. And I think that was eloquently put. Yeah, I don't know what to add to that. Just like as a sociologist, we, you know, constantly are confronting a cycle of injustice and inequality that is perpetuated generation after generation.
It's kind of like what they were saying when we were learning in Marx, how Marx built the whole blueprint to, you know, how we can get out of this sticky situation that we have allowed to be created, but there is no manuscript to what would happen after we have done it. And I think it's the same with history. It's like we repeat it and we do learn from it, but we don't know what to do after we learn from it. So yet we keep doing it somehow. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very painful to watch. Okay, let's get into capital because I want to specifically look at the text in this kind of Bible study kind of way. Not that we're going to treat capital as a sacred text or something, but more like that it's very difficult to understand. I would say it's more difficult than any of his other writings, and so therefore, I think I can help you the most with understanding the text itself. So there's this kind of introduction that the editors of the book wrote that I think is pretty clear and helps like introduce you to Das Kapital and some of its main concerns. And y'all have carried on a pretty good dialogue about this just on the basis of this introduction. So I don't feel as much need to go through the annotations for this introduction as much as I do for the text itself, which again is notoriously difficult. And that even people who are like professional scholars of Marx argue about how to interpret certain um, passages and parts of the text. And so that's where I want to like focus energies because that's where I think that I can help you the most. It starts off with this pithy little two sentences, but they may be short, but they're very important. Where he says, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of a commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Okay, so and then the next sentence is our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. So, first of all, what this is suggesting is that what we call capitalism, or he says here, the capitalist mode of production, presents itself as this immense accumulation of commodities. Like when you go into like a Costco or a supermarket, and there's just every conceivable commodity on the shelves that are all around you. Or now when we go to the Amazon website, or eBay, or any of these other, just the web in general, is just an immense accumulation of commodities. That's what makes up capitalism, is this immense accumulation of stuff that is to be bought and sold. So remember, a commodity is anything, and this includes people, like people's labor, anything that is bought and sold on the marketplace is a commodity. It's a real simple, easy to understand definition. And so the commodity, it says, therefore, is like the single unit, right? It is what scientists would call the unit of analysis. I'll bring up this concept of unit analysis when we talk about Durkheim and Weber also. But the idea is that the fundamental unit of analysis of capitalism is the commodity. It's like the atom in physics, right? It's the thing. And so he says, therefore, our investigation must begin with the analysis of a commodity. So we have to take this single thing, this commodity. I have jokingly referred to Labubus in this context. And we have to kind of like open the commodity and take a look inside. And if we can understand where the commodity comes from, we can kind of have this greater insight into the system as a whole. So it's this kind of this thing where we're looking at the singular object. The singular object reveals a whole pattern of relationships and dynamics. So if we looked at a Labubu, it would show us the secrets of like this whole Chinese system of manufacturing and like production in which, you know, it might take us to a factory, you know, full of teenage girls who are making, you know, $2 a day to manufacture these labubus that are then, you know, being sold like hotcakes.
Are you
Um,
talking about the little dolls that are really
yeah, yeah,
popular?
yeah. You know,
Oh
those
my
little.
gosh, I'm asking Siri like, who is Labubu? Because my son talks about it.
I'm sorry, I got started on this last time, and I've made this comment, and I'm just kind of using it as an example. I also just kind of like saying the word labubu, but just it could be anything. You know, looking at a single commodity, how it's produced, how it's distributed, how it's consumed, tells us this story. It unlocks this mystery of how does capitalism work. So we could take a different example. I think Precious, you suggested like a diamond ring. Correct me if I'm wrong. I thought that was your example, right? So if we looked at a diamond ring, starting with like how it's, you know, excavated in Africa, you know, by like people who are working under really, you know, abysmal conditions, right? And then how it is then exported, and then like how it's advertised, you know, and how a diamond ring comes to stand for marriage and love and romance and all these things that people come to want. So like, you know, how it's not only how it's like produced, how the diamond is taken out of the ground, but then how it's promoted and advertised and made into this symbolic this status object. That tells us a lot about capitalism in terms of how it works. So the idea is to kind of like take an individual commodity and look at how it came to be as a way of understanding this whole system, you know, that incorporates people, you know, all over the world. So that's the idea of what's being suggested here. And notice too, he uses the word presents itself. In some translations, it says like um, the capitalist mode of production appears as an immense accumulation of commodities. So what that suggests is that this is just kind of at the surface level. This is just how the system presents itself, but that there's something like behind the curtain that we don't see, that doesn't present itself, that's below the surface. And that is the human labor that goes into producing those commodities. So, you know, when we go and buy a Labubu, we don't see the you know, the teenage Chinese girls that made them, you know, in some sweatshop factory. When we buy a diamond ring, we don't see like the African, you know, kids that excavated them out of some diamond mine, you know, in South Africa. um, we don't see those things do not present themselves. They are under the surface, and that's going to be a recurring theme for Marx, is this kind of invisible labor that is done in the production of commodities. And it's that invisible labor that gives the commodities their value. And yet, because we don't see it, it's like the commodity might as well have just dropped out of the sky or come out of the ground. Another example I tried to give, because I know a lot of you are from the Central Valley. Um, and I think it seems that a lot of you have parents who are farm workers. And so a good example is this California agriculture in the Central Valley that's worth billions of dollars, produces so much value in terms of commodities, of, fruits and vegetables. And yet the labor that goes into producing those fruits and vegetables is, like hidden from view. You go into a supermarket and you don't know where like those strawberries came from. You don't know where those like, oranges or the lettuce, you don't, they're just commodities that appear in a marketplace with a price tag. And the value that went into creating them, the thing that gives them their value is labor. And yet that labor is like disguised from us. This is what he's going to call the fetishism of commodities, in which commodities seem to take on this magical power that is like independent of their creators, that is independent of those who produce them. And in that regard, there's like a connection between his discussion of commodity fetishism with the earlier discussion of alienation, and the way that workers produce things that then seem to take on a life of their own independently of their creators. This is the thing that he compares to like religious alienation. Precious, did you have a hand up? I got into a
Yeah, I was just wondering, now I'm thinking something else, but back then I wrote it down. I was wondering about what was Marx saying? Because you were talking about the diamond and how lavish it is to all of us, and that's based on, the emphasis that we have placed behind that product. But how do demand play into that? Like, say, right now diamonds are the big thing because people have money to be able to do that, but what happens if, like, water becomes scarce or something that's a necessity becomes scarce? Will the market value of that rise higher than the diamond? Or am I making sense?
So that we have to distinguish between what Marx calls value and price. Okay, so value and price are related but not the same thing. They're like cousins. Okay, so things that what gives something its value, according to Marx, is the amount of labor that goes into producing it. Okay, this is what's called the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value basically says like the more human labor that is spent to produce something, the more valuable it is, as a general rule. Price is related to value, but not the same thing, in the sense that things can, depending on supply and demand, prices can rise or fall relative to their value. So things can be overpriced, in terms of like their price is greater than their value, or things can be underpriced in the sense that like their price is lower than their value. So, your example like of water, if there's a scarcity of water, the value of the water won't change, but the price will, because of the demand. Or to go back to my example about labubus, right? The trendiness, the faddishness of the labubu has caused its price to rise. Like some of these things, are selling for, hundreds or even thousands of dollars, I understand, on eBay and other kinds of markets, because there's just such a demand relative to the supply.
Okay,
But that doesn't make the labubus more valuable.
Do you have a labubu?
No, I do not. No, I'm simply fascinated by the
I'm just
phenomenon.
teasing you.
And
I'm sorry.
I just keep using the example just to, I could say like widgets, like, sometimes when people are talking about economics, they talk about widgets, and it's like, what is a widget? Well, a widget isn't anything. It's just like, the example that we're using. that could stand in for any number of examples, but there is no such thing as a widget. So I'm just using Labubu in the same kind of way. But just to emphasize, like, just because the price of a Labubu goes to, you know, $5,000 doesn't make it more valuable. You know, the price is just kind of like overvalued. So this is an important distinction for Marx. The idea that value and price, they're related, you can't separate them, right? Like ultimately a price, you know, kind of hovers around the value of a thing, right? So all things being equal, you know, price will be like equivalent to value. And value will be determined by the amount of labor that goes into producing something. But in some, you know, cases, when we look at individual commodities like a diamond or a Labubu or a house in California, you know, those things can be overpriced relative to their value, and other things can be underpriced relative to their value. I hope that helps clarify the relationship between these two things. Again, that you can't separate, but they're not the same. They're like cousins. So here he breaks down this category of value into these two parts. All commodities have what he calls an exchange value and a use value. All right. And that's what he's going to talk about here in the next, like, I don't know, 6, 7 paragraphs, something like that. So he starts with use value. And he's saying, like, basically the use value has to do with just how some commodity meets human needs or wants. What does he say? The commodity, the object outside is a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. And he basically says, like, the nature of those wants, whether, for instance, they spring from the stomach or from the fancy, makes no difference. He's basically saying, like, he doesn't really care for the purposes of this analysis where the wants or needs come from. He's going to kind of like bracket that to the side, you know. So we're not really concerned with how the object satisfies those wants. So, you know, to use the examples that, you know, we've been using, like, you know, like the turkey sandwich that I had for lunch today had superb use value for satisfying my need of hunger. I'm pleased to report it was a good sandwich and had tremendous use value. So there's all kinds of commodities that we consume in the course of our lives that have this kind of like direct use value. They feed us, or they clothe us, or, you know, like the use value of my laptop computer that I'm talking to you here. It's extremely useful. I don't know what I would do without it. Likewise, the use value of my phone as a tool of communication, very extremely valuable. But then there's other things that don't seem to have that kind of tangible use value, like a Labubu or a diamond ring. A diamond ring, you know, I guess has use value if you need to cut glass. But otherwise, its use value is more symbolic. It's of like a social status. And likewise, this is with a Labubu, or you know, somebody mentioned, I think Paige mentioned, like those Stanley Cup thermoses, right? Where it has some use value in terms of being able to hold liquid, but it also has use value as something that you kind of like show off to other people. So, you know, I don't know, like a Louis Vuitton purse, or you know, a pair of luxury sneakers or something like that can have use value, you know, in the sense of like a purse holds stuff, or, you know, shoes allow you to, you know, walk without going barefoot. But then they also have this kind of extra symbolic status, this kind of social status. The use value of them is really to kind of show off to other people. So this is, what he's saying, and he kind of is like, okay, well, we're going to kind of like bracket this discussion out of use value, and then we're going to turn then to the second component of value. All commodities have an exchange value. So this is basically a more quantifiable entity, something that has like a number attached to it, in the sense of what can you exchange the commodity for. With a diamond ring, for example, it was long said, I don't know if people still say this, but back in like the 50s and 60s, they would say that, a man should spend 3 months of his salary on a diamond ring, if he wants the woman to marry him. And so this was like the exchange value of a diamond ring was 3 months salary, right? So this is the sort of the equivalent of one commodity for another. You sell your labor power for 3 months, regardless of, whether you're a construction worker or a teacher or whatever. And that 3 months, so that diamond ring is supposed to be worth like 3 months of your labor power, your ability to work. We don't generally do things that way. We don't trade, like in trade, like barter systems, people would trade one commodity for another. But eventually, like sort of what happened is like money became the intermediary to, like the common denominator between these various goods. So, we don't go to the jeweler and say, hey, I'll trade you 3 months of my labor for a diamond. We have money that we use to buy these things. That just, obviously simplifies the process of exchange. So when we talk about the exchange value of something, we generally mean its price, the quantifiable number that demonstrates its value on the market. As I said, value and price are not the same thing. It's important to realize that they're not the same thing, but that they are related to one another. And so basically, the more labor that goes into a commodity, the more exchange value it acquires. Like if you own a house and you build an extra room, or you renovate the kitchen, or you add some labor, it increases the exchange value of that house. It's what in the real estate market, they call sweat equity. The amount of labor, the amount of sweat that goes into the commodity increases its value. Now, if the housing market then suddenly crashes, then the price of the house may decline, but the value will still be the same. So what you have there is like a house that now all of a sudden, because the housing market has crashed, is underpriced relative to its value. But it still has, it's still like a new house with a new kitchen or an extra bedroom. The fact that the price decline didn't change that. So the value and the price, again, are related but not the same. So this is sort of what he's talking about here about commodities and their exchangeability. And so he's kind of coming to a question, like a mystery. In this paragraph, these 2 paragraphs here, he's basically suggesting, well, all commodities have to have something in common in order for them to be exchanged. Like in mathematics, there has to be some common denominator, in order for like fractions to be added together or subtracted from one another. You have to have this common thing. And so he's like, well, what is this common thing? This common something cannot either be a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of the commodities. So it's not about the common denominator is not to be found in the commodities themselves. It's something that is common to all commodities. All commodities have this certain something that allows them to be exchanged for one another. And so what is that thing? That is the sort of the mystery that he's allowing us into. And spoiler alert, the answer, the common denominator, is the human labor that goes into producing them. This is what all commodities have, is they are in some way or another that, even if it's just a matter of human labor that is extracting a rock out of a diamond mine, that is still human labor. Even if it's a matter of humans in the Central Valley picking strawberries, that is human labor. All commodities have, to some extent, labor that goes into producing them. And that is what allows them to be exchanged in this quantitative way. So what he will basically, the conclusion that he will draw from this is that the exchange value of all commodities comes down to the amount of labor that went into producing them. And more specifically, the amount of time that is spent by workers to create that value. So basically, the more time that goes into creating something, the more valuable it is. This is what he is basically discussing in these two paragraphs here. Now, he adds a very important qualification to this. He starts with this question: how then is the magnitude of this value to be measured? Plainly by the quantity of the value creating substance, the labor. So the labor is the thing that creates the value. It's the labor creating value creating substance contained in the article. The quantity of labor, however, is measured by its duration, and labor time is in its turn finds its standard in weeks, days, and hours. So again, it comes down to specifically the amount of time that goes into creating these things. That is how we measure the exchange value of a commodity. Now, however, he says basically here that if it takes me like 3 days to make a labubu, at home with my sewing machine or whatever, and the same labubu can be created in a Chinese factory in an hour, that doesn't make my labubu more valuable. They have the same value. And so that's why Marx stresses this idea of the socially necessary amount of labor time. He says here, let me see if I find the exact sentence. The amount, I can't highlight here because I've already highlighted it, but I think you can see where my pointer is. The labor time socially necessary is that would require to produce an article under the normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. So the socially necessary and under normal conditions of production. So like me making a labubu on my sewing machine at home is not normal. It's not under normal conditions of production when these things can be mass produced in a factory in a much cheaper kind of and faster way. And with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. So it's basically like you have to think about these things in terms of like what's possible in society as a whole at the time, given the level of like technology and the average amount of skill and intensity at a time. So again, just because it takes me longer to produce something than can be produced in a factory doesn't make it more valuable. We calculate that value in terms of the average level of productivity. It's sometimes called like the productivity index by economists. And he starts to begin to say something important here that's going to be a key, like he's foreshadowing some stuff that like will become very important here later, which is that over time, what happens is that capital is able to produce more and more at a faster rate for cheaper. That the new technologies and new innovations come into play that increase the rate of productivity so that you can produce more commodities at a faster pace by putting them on an assembly line, for example. Take the example of shoes, right? Like shoes used to be produced by these so-called shoemakers who were working with, in a more of like a craft work kind of way. Now shoes are manufactured in an assembly line way where they can be churned out at a much faster pace, a much higher level of productivity. And Marx is saying that this happens in all industries over time. And it's kind of true if you look at, like say automobiles. The first automobiles were very expensive to produce, and you could only produce them very slowly. Once Ford introduced the assembly line in Detroit in 1905, it became possible to mass produce cars in a way where you could produce them at, more cheaply in a shorter amount of time and at a faster rate. And hence the value and the price of the car began to decline. The first cars were only really like affordable for the really elite and rich people. But by the 1920s and certainly into the 1950s, everybody had a car, because they could be kind of mass produced in this way. Computers are another good example. The very first computers were these enormous, machines that took, months to build and were therefore affordable, only to like corporations and the military and the government. And now, we can produce these things at such a fast rate that everybody has, like at least one computer, seemingly. So this is a thing that we find in every industry is the increasing rate of productivity that is enabled by new technologies and new innovations like the assembly line. Remember Marx saying in the Communist Manifesto, like the increasing productivity, the increasing instruments of production, is the thing that really defines capitalism. Is that this that it becomes more and more productive. Now, this carries with it a kind of an irony because as you're producing more of these things, the value of them is going to go down. Once you can produce a car or a computer or a Labubu in, a faster amount of time, then their value, the amount of labor that went into producing them declines. So these things become cheaper, and they also kind of like lose some of their quality. They become mass produced. So, you know, you could think of like fast fashion or like fast food, right? They've got fast right there in the title, you know, so they're more quickly produced. You can churn out more burgers or pairs of jeans or whatever in an hour. You know, you can produce these things very quickly, but they're of lower value and lower quality. You know, so like in Europe, they have the, you know, as opposed to fast food, they have the slow food movement, you know, to try to emphasize, you know, the value of food as opposed to what's happened with the sort of McDonaldization, um, you know, and the emphasis on efficiency, or you know, in fashion and clothing, there's the same kind of movement, you know, kind of away from fast fashion and towards things that are more like handcrafted, right? So that is something that Marx is kind of anticipating, and it's another way in which, ironically and unintentionally, capitalism kind of undermines itself. This is another contradiction of capitalism, is that they, by increasing the rate of productivity, they erode the value of the things that they produce. So keep that in your hat because it becomes more prevalent, more important later. So this is what he's kind of saying here. The discussion of that kind of goes more into this, and he starts talking about diamonds actually. So the productivity of labor with new technologies and innovations like the assembly line allow more commodities to be produced in shorter periods of time. It accelerates the socially necessary labor time embodied in commodities. That socially necessary labor time then decreases. The amount of labor time that goes into those commodities declines, and so the commodities become cheaper as they can be mass produced. So again, all commodities have both use value and exchange value. And Marx sort of reiterates this point. He comes back to use value after, in the beginning of this chapter, he kind of introduces use value and then kind of goes away from it, and then he comes back to it at the end of this section. And he's basically saying that, like, if a commodity has no use, even as a status symbol, then it has no value. So like the example that the editors use is like of a one-legged stool. I can spend, you know, my entire weekend making a one-legged stool, but if it doesn't, you know, allow me to do the things the stool, you know, is necessary for, then it has no value, unless I can somehow turn it into like a status symbol, or I don't know, use it as a weapon, or, you know, like some repurpose it in some kind of way. So when we look at this world of commodities, we have to think about, like, what is the use value of them? What do they do for people? You know, what kind of wants or needs do they fulfill for people? In some instances, it's very obvious, like the turkey sandwich I had for lunch. The use value of that is very clear. It's not a status symbol. It just, you know, feeds my need for hunger. In other cases, it's not clear what the use value is. You know, like a labubu, and we have to sort of like investigate that. And there's, I would say, a lot of commodities in our contemporary capitalist society where it's like, you know, what is the use value of this thing? You know, like what does it do for people? Why are people buying it? Why do people want it? You know, go ahead, Precious.
I would say that we have come, our world now is so like superficial and we're so materialized according to the social norms that
Mhm.
that is our want. We have crossed our wants and our needs pretty much. So basically the things like the labubus, we think we need them, but we actually just want them. But it's a superficial need that we have within ourselves that has evolved with social norms as time has progressed.
Yeah. Some Marxists would say that these are false needs, that basically we've been like manipulated or brainwashed into thinking that we need these things when we really don't. And this whole question about like the difference between needs and wants is really tricky. You know, even in our own like personal lives, you know, it's hard to know like what's the difference between like what we need versus what we want. There's a lot of like gray area there, you know. Um, so I tend to not buy too much into the idea of false needs. I kind of think like even the most trivial or faddish or stupid kind of thing, it's got to be doing something for somebody, you know? And like it's worth like questioning like what is it? And a lot of times it comes down to like, you know, showing off one's social status. That's a really important thing. And it, you know, you find that all over the world in different iterations. People wear certain kinds of clothing or, you know, fashion or, you know, the car that they drive or whatever. You know, like part of the use value is to kind of make a statement to other people, like this is who I am, and you know, it's like to show off, kind of.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the more you explain, it sounds like there's layers to it. Like the for me, the very bottom layer is to metaphorically speak, is to say a need is something that I can't live without, a necessity that keeps me alive, as
Uh-huh.
compared to a want is something that I could live without, but it makes my life more convenient. But
Yeah,
then when you start talking about like social statuses, in the world we live in now, your social status is pretty much everything. You know, this depends on where you can work, how you can, how much wages you can earn, how you will live in this society. So is, do you understand like how I'm seeing it?
totally.
Okay.
Like, yeah, the need for recognition by others, the need for status and some kind of self-respect. I mean, that's a real need because we are social creatures. We need to be recognized and validated by others, you know, in the same way that we need like water and shelter and food. um you know, we're not going to drop dead from lack of social status, but we are social beings in the sense that we need that kind of recognition. And so it's not always easy for me to know the difference between what's a need and what's a want when it comes to these things.
Do sorry, do you think that like okay, this is a little far-fetched, but the whole thing of like just the social, the need just to, because we are social beings, so that social need is actually a necessity. And if we take that necessity away, we will create a solitude, which would then catapult us back into like caveman time where we become, you know, a bit crazy. Not crazy, I don't want to
Yeah,
be offensive, but you know, like that.
yeah. Like, I mean, as we talked about with, you know, solitary confinement a couple of weeks ago, like um, these are things that can, you know, human beings will really suffer. without that kind of social environment. I mean, involuntary or solitude is maybe an extreme form. Solitary confinement is maybe an extreme form of this. But people, if they don't have community and they find themselves alone, they do all kinds of pathological things. I mean, we're seeing this all across the society today with like school shooters and mass shootings and things, and all kinds of antisocial behavior that is produced, I think, in a lot of ways by um, people who feel alone, and like that no one understands them and no one hears them and no one validates them or recognizes them in some way.
And okay, so basically it wouldn't catapult us to like caveman time, but it would radicalize us in a way, right?
I would
To do crazy.
Marx would say that it dehumanizes us to be alone and alienated from other people. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't know about reverting to caveman times, but it would deny us of something that is fundamentally human. Let me close off the class by previewing what we're going to do next, because it's sort of important. We're going to get into this discussion of what Marx calls commodity fetishism. And this is a pretty fun section where he talks about the way that commodities take on these kind of like magical kinds of qualities beyond their immediate use value, so that like a car becomes more than a car, or a pair of shoes becomes more than a pair of shoes. They take on this like this extra thing. And it has to do with this word fetishism, which is important to get this straight, that like in our time, people talk about like fetishism in this like sexualized way, like fetish for objects or something like this. But in Marx's time, it had more to do with a kind of like a religion, like when so-called primitive peoples worshipped objects, and they believed that those objects possessed like supernatural kind of spirits. So they worshipped rocks or plants or animals or rivers, whatever, because they believed that they were endowed with like supernatural qualities, like magical or theological or spiritual kinds of qualities. And Marx is saying basically that this is what happens with commodities in a capitalist society. In a sense, we start to like worship them. And so Marx is doing what we would today kind of like call trolling. He's like trolling American, like what or European Western capitalist societies, saying, "Oh, you think you're so much better than these so-called primitive savages who worshipped, rocks and plants and animals and stuff like that, and put them on totem poles, and had their whole religion based on these totems. But in fact, you're doing the same thing. It's just like you worship, money, and you worship commodities, and you worship, stuff. And so you're no better than these people that you think are savages, or, primitive people who you make fun of for worshiping like plants and animals and stuff like that. You do the same thing with like money, and your whole life revolves around stuff. And like things are in charge, things rule over you, and you worship them. And so Marx is doing a little bit of trolling here in this section on the fetishism of commodities. I'm real eager to teach you about that starting in the next class. I think that pretty much, though, will do it for today. Much appreciate all of you who were here, and I will see you next time.